Hello my friends, welcome to my corner. Looking at the videos that I have done, I was doing that the other day and I realized that there are not many poets that I have talked about when it comes to our Nobel Prize journey. Actually, I think I have only talked about Pablo Neruda and Gabriela Mistral, so we have the two Chilean poets right there. But I was thinking, hey, if I talk about Octavio Paz, if we explore his work, then we will have covered all of the Latin American winners of the Nobel Prize in literature. So that is exactly what we're going to do today, my friend. We're going to explore the work of Octavio Paz, who won the Nobel Prize in Literature in the year 1990 for impassioned writing with wide horizons, characterized by sensuous intelligence and humanistic integrity. So let's talk about this magnificent poet from Mexico. What we're going to do is we're going to look at his view of poetry, what poetry means to him, some themes, some ideas about his style. We're going to have an overview of his works, and I also want to tell you we are going to focus on a poem titled Piedra de Sol, or Sunstone, because that is a major work in his poetic output. So we do want to focus a little bit at least on that. So let me give you first some quick information, biographical, about Octavio Paz. We're going to keep it relevant, things that actually had some kind of an influence in his work. Octavio Paz was born in Mexico City in the year 1914, so the same year as Julio Cortázar, just so that we can put this in some context. And he passed away also in Mexico City in the year 1998. He spent a couple of years in the US when he was a kid. It was a difficult situation for him because he came to the US without speaking a single word of English. So communication was definitely a difficult thing right there. And as a young man, he traveled to Europe like many of his generation. There he met César Vallejo and Pablo Neruda. Then he would go on to travel also to Spain, France, within Europe, and also to meet the existentialists, and also before that the surrealists. So he had quite a European experience there also. He felt attracted to leftist ideas at some point, but he was a little bit disillusioned. He studied here in the US, he studied at Berkeley, and then in the 50s and in the 60s he was an ambassador of Mexico to Japan and to India. This had a profound influence in his work, and you can definitely feel it. Now, he resigned from those diplomatic posts after and as a response to the massacre of Tlatelolco, which happened in the year 1968. And after that, he basically taught at different universities, and he continued to produce poetry, essays, and many amazing works that he is well known for. So the first thing we want to do, I think this is a first step that is very good, is to look at Paz's view of poetry in his own words. Okay, so I'm going to share with you some thoughts that he has on poetry itself. Most of these, just so you know, are quotes. Some of them are a little bit paraphrased, but for the most part I tried to stick to quotes. So Paz said at one point that the poem is not an object but an act. Poetry is something to be lived, an experience that has the potential to change the individual and the world. There is no prose, according to Paz. Everything in language is poetry. Hold that thought. I'm going to give you some details about that. The poem is an organism in perpetual rotation. That is also something that we want to continue to ponder on. And finally, the poem does not mean, but rather generates meanings. It is language in its purest form. So all of this has to do, of course, with some themes that we're going to find in his poetry, because the poetry reflects his ideas on the thing itself. But regarding that thing between the distinction between poetry and prose, he says there is no prose, everything is poetry. One of his collections of stories is titled Águila o Sol, with a question mark. That refers to a Mexican coin that has an eagle and the sun in the two sides. It's basically like saying heads or tails, right? In Spanish we say cara o seca, cara o cruz. Sometimes in Mexico it's águila o sol. And these are prose poems, some of them very short, and some of them are actually the kind of text that you can also read as a short story, as a short. For example, I have a little anthology, I'm going to show it to you someday, of short shorts, and they include one of these by Octavio Paz. It's titled The Blue Bouquet. El Ramo Azul. So if you can find that, that will give you an idea of that prose poetry that he writes that can also be narrative. So let's look now at the development of his poetry. Basically, there are two main phases. This is according to Paz himself, and most critics agree on this. There's one poem that sort of marks before and then after, and that is Piedra de Sol, or Sunstone. It doesn't really happen in the midpoint of his poetic output. It's more close, it's closer to the beginning, right? But those are the two different phases right there. Before Sunstone, what we have is a series of collections of poetry that are titled Libertad bajo palabra, or technically, I mean word by word, that would be liberty under word. That's freedom on parole, right? Freedom under word, or something like that. This would be about a fourth, I would say, of his whole poetic output. Now, this is a fluid work, okay? It's like Leaves of Grass by Walt Whitman. There are many things that are known as Leaves of Grass, and the same thing goes with Libertad bajo palabra, because Paz revisited this book many times, okay? So he kept deciding what was going to be part of this, what was not. So what we get as a result is basically the poet being his own reader and revising and deciding what he was going to include here. Just to give you a quick example, there were some political poems that referred to very specific events, so those were discarded. I'm going to tell you a little bit more about that later on. Now, this collection right here includes Sunstone. It is the very last poem that is included here. And after that, what happens is that we get poetry that reflects the fact that Paz started to learn more about Eastern cultures, when he was in Japan, when he was in India. So basically, this collection in English, which is titled The Collected Poems of Octavio Paz, 1957 to 1987, begins with Sunstone, and it gives you basically all of the rest of the poems, except maybe for the last few that he wrote. And that would be a quick overview in terms of how his poetry developed. Now, I'm going to throw at you some themes, okay? I always like to do this when it comes to poetry, because then you can be on the lookout for certain things. And the first one that I'm going to mention is the notion of rotation. There's a circular nature to life and to existence, to the world itself. The poem Sunstone actually has a circular structure. So that's the first one that I'm going to go with. The second one is a favorite theme of mine, which is doubles, the good old doppelganger theme. And this is the fact in this case, right, in this context, that the act of writing involves a kind of a split in the personality. This is just like Borges. You remember Borges and I, this idea that there were two of them. So for example, in the case of Paz, there's a poem titled Mientras escribo, or While I Write, As I Write, in which the poet creates himself through the act of writing, and also through the act of writing comes back, returns to being himself again. It's a circular thing once again. So the idea of the doubles is connected to that idea of rotation that I was mentioning before. And then there's also another little poem by Paz, famous one, titled La Calle, or The Street, in which he is walking down a street and he sees another person, only to realize at the end that that person is himself. So you have the two people looking at each other, staring at each other right there. Third important theme, that would be inadequacy. So for Paz, as for many poets, right, you could say maybe most of all, the word is the source, right? But at the same time, he is quite aware of the limitations of language, of even, I would say, the inadequacy of words, which brings us directly to the fourth theme, which is paradox, okay? Just like Kierkegaard, just like Chesterton, Paz was an author who was very conscious of the fact that sometimes human existence is governed by things that only seem to be contradictions. So paradox, you're going to find it all over his work. This idea of, for example, losing oneself in order to find oneself, that kind of thing, So many examples of that. So be on the lookout for those. And then finally, the fifth thing that I wanted to mention, I don't know if this is, it's a theme, it's a recurring image right here, but gardens. Borges had his labyrinths, Paz has his gardens. And this is a series of gardens that are actually one garden. That is what he said. Okay, these are his words right there. It's kind of like an archetype almost, in the sense of a place in this case, right? A place, a garden that is all gardens. And for Paz, this is also from his own words. The garden is the place of revelation. So very interesting conception of this idea of gardens. I mean, you could write a book about the place of gardens in poetry, from the beginning to modern times. Now we want to talk about the style. Okay, so here what we're going to focus on is diction, the concept of meaning, the idea of meaning, and then also something that I want to call the almost mystical mode that Paz goes into sometimes. So those are three things that we want to look at. In terms of the style, the diction, what I'm going to say is that it's very precise. It's not necessarily complex. The words that he uses are not complicated or anything like that, but he will not hesitate to use sometimes, every now and then, a lesser known word or even an archaic term in order to say exactly what he wants to say. Now, that is the diction itself. When it comes to the meaning, sometimes it can get a little bit complex because he is talking about existential stuff, and sometimes he reaches what I have called, what I said before, some kind of a mystical realm with his poetry. That's where it gets a little bit more difficult. But here's something to consider. If you look at the mystics like Saint Teresa of Avila, Saint John of the Cross, most of the time what they did was to use the physical world in order to express metaphysical things, transcendent things. Paz does something different. What he does, I think, is to make the physical metaphysical, to make the physical transcendent. So it's kind of like a reversion that he goes into when it comes to the typical approach of the traditional mystics, if we can call them that. Now, some highlights of his poetic work, okay, the works that he published. Let me give you just a quick idea of what books to look out for, what kind of poems, and all that. So if you look at his early phase, which is once again Libertad bajo palabra, this is basically the influence of surrealism that you're going to find here, existentialism also. And the reason why he took those political poems out, the ones that refer to very specific things that had happened, is because he is going for the universal right here. You can accept that, you can criticize it, but that is basically his rationale when it comes to this. After this one comes Sunstone, which is included in this particular edition. We're going to explore that one in detail in a couple of minutes. Then there's a very important poem titled Blanco. And blanco is a word that, of course, you hear it and you think, yeah, it means white. It means white. It can also mean a target. Un blanco, like when you're shooting an arrow, So that is another meaning of that word, and there are many more. But this is a very interesting poem because this one was published as a sheet of paper that was folded into many parts. And Paz said that there are actually 20 different ways that you can read this poem. So it's a poem in space, not in time. I think that's wonderful. I was reminded of Rayuela, Hopscotch, Julio Cortázar's novel. There are many ways to read it. Same thing here. It's like you can decide how to read this poem. And also, of course, we have to consider the influence of Stéphane Mallarmé, the one about the throw of the dice, right? These poems that are published in a landscape format. Julio Cortázar also experimented with that in his poetry, but to be completely honest with you, I don't think the result was very good. I'll be honest with you, I don't really like the poetry of Julio Cortázar very much. I think he's an excellent cuentista, teller of short stories, but the poetry, there are some amazing lines every now and then, some amazing poems, but for the most part, it did not really work that well for me. But in the case of Paz, he does something wonderful with these spaces. And speaking of that, there are some poems by him known as the topoemas. I'm going to see, yeah, I can find them right here. These are also, I don't know if you can see it from there, but these are also poems that are visual. You can look at them, they are shapes. And they work in a wonderful way. You don't know sometimes where to start reading them or where to end, but the point is you decide. It's completely up to you. There's even one poem here in which you get, for example, it looks like a little asterisk or something, different numbers, and below you have lines with those numbers, and you basically have to put the poem together. So it requires the participation of the reader. I think that is amazing. That is a typical boom, Latin American boom attitude to things. You are part of the process of creation. We have to remember that poetry means literally, by etymology, creation. So those are the topoemas. And after that, the one that I wanted to mention was one titled Pasado en Claro. I can't remember exactly how they translate it. Let me see if I can find that. It should be easy to find. Yeah, a draft of shadows. So it's very interesting because the word pasado, of course, can mean to pass, as in to write down a draft, but it can also mean the past. So it's a very interesting play with words that is unfortunately lost right there. And this one, Pasado en Claro, is a poetic memoir about Paz's childhood and also adolescence. So after that, we have his last major collection of poetry, which is Árbol Adentro, or A Tree Within, which is absolutely amazing. I mean, I was just, amazed by the poetry in his next to last collection of poems, the most important one, probably the last important one that he published, because most of the time, at least in my experience, to me, poets, it's like they reach a point. It's like, and after that, their work begins to get maybe repetitive, maybe a little plain or something like that. In the case of Paz, that is not what happens. Okay, that collection, the Árbol Adentro, or A Tree Within, is simply astonishing. It's so thought-provoking, so deep. He really goes like that. It's really quite amazing. So let's focus a little bit on Sunstone, as I promised you. Okay, we're going to look at this major poem. This is Octavio Paz's masterpiece when it comes to poetry. It has 584 hendecasyllabic lines, so lines of 11 syllables, because the Aztec calendar has 584 days to it. And actually, in this Cátedra edition that I have right here, they very appropriately chose the Aztec calendar as the image to put in the cover. Piedra de Sol, or Sunstone, that is what we call the Aztec calendar. So it's an equivalent right there with the title. Now, this poem doesn't really have a beginning or an end, because the ending of the poem repeats and takes you back to the beginning. I think that is amazing also. So you see that rotation, that circularity that I was telling you about before in terms of themes. And get this, Paz says that the first lines of this poem were dictated to him. So they were written almost like in a trance. So we have here the poet as a Vedic figure, kind of like a prophet, kind of like an oracle. It's the kind of thing that happens when you write something and then you read it many years or maybe some months later and you're like, did I write this? This is exactly what's going on with these lines. And when you start reading the poem Sunstone, you ask yourself, you wonder, what is he talking about precisely? Is he talking about life? Is he talking about the human condition? Is he talking about poetry? All of the above, plus many more options too. Remember, there is no single meaning. What we have is, not just one meaning, but something, the poem, that generates different meanings according to different readers and also to different times in which you're reading a single poem. This is ideally what poetry would do. So, very interesting approach right here. Now, at one point in the poem, very clearly, after these enigmatic lines, they could be enigmatic at the beginning, at least the first time we read it, the poet encounters the figure of the lover. He has an encounter with a lover who is a woman, but she is also all the women who have been loved. This is, once again, an archetype. It's a woman who is all women, who is the idea of woman herself. And the encounter produces in the poet or the speaker a sort of an overwhelming effect. It's not something positive, it's not something negative, it's just overpowering. He forgets his name, for example, so he basically loses his identity. And the idea here is to transcend the ego, which is a very important theme in the poetry of Octavio Paz. I would say beginning with Sunstone, it's present also before, but primarily beginning with Sunstone and especially afterwards. Remember that he encountered Eastern philosophy too, so that is a major theme right there. Now, right before that happens, right before he has that encounter with love, he becomes aware of time, okay, of the passing of time. So you can see here how love is presented as a struggle against time. It's a way to transcend also, to go beyond that notion of time. That is really what binds us, to this life and to this earth. To love is to fight, it says at one point. To love is to divest ourselves of our names. So once again, that idea of transcending is present right there. There's a sequence that explores all the things that keep us from becoming our poetic selves, if you want. I mean, I don't want to use the word self because it's about transcending the self, right? But I would say maybe it's about realizing our true poetic nature. And the obstacles to that are mainly the institutions in society. There's a sequence also that is dedicated to the importance of rooms in our lives. Another sequence mentions the names of people, historical characters, who died maybe through betrayal or through some kind of an act of injustice. And when you get towards the end of Sunstone, there's one image that emerges very clearly as a central one, and that is fire. Okay, just as in the fire sermon, just as in The Wasteland, which by the way was a huge influence. The moment when Paz read The Wasteland was something that became very important to him. And there you have also an incorporation of the fire sermon, the burning, 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 and all that kind of stuff. So putting all this together, I would say that if you wanted to look at the major themes, the way that Sunstone or Piedra del Sol is constructed, this is basically a braid of three major themes, and those are time, identity, and love. The poem is all about how those elements interact with each other. Now, you want to read Octavio Paz. I think after what we have talked about, I can sense that. I can really sense that. So what book should you get? Or better yet, what books should you get? So let's start with, if you want to read him in English, okay? One thing that you can do is get this collection right here, the Poems of Octavio Paz, which covers all of his work, okay? From the beginning to the very first poem, from the very first poem that he published to the very last one. Or another thing that you can do is you can get this one right here, the collected poems of Octavio Paz that I have shown you before. This covers from Sunstone onward. And by the way, the two that I have just shown you, these two, there's something wonderful about them, and that is that they are both bilingual parallel text editions. And let me tell you, the translations are very good. Okay, I was very, very happy with the translations. Of course, there are problems. Of course, there are times when you translate a poem or basically anything in which you have to make a decision that maybe closes a door. Or, it's kind of like cutting branches sometimes. There's a branch right there of meaning that the poem had, and because of a decision, because the play with words is lost, then that branch doesn't exist anymore. But I was very happy with the translations. They have many translators, but primarily they are by Elliot Weinberger. He is also the editor. He knew Paz from a very early age. They were friends. So that's something to consider right there. Now, with the collected poems, the one that I just showed you, with this one, you're going to be missing the first phase, okay? But in the anthology, the other one, if you look at the first phase, that is only about a quarter of this book right here. So it's not that much. But then, if you really want to experience the entirety of his work, the two phases, I would say you could go with this one. Now in this one, Sunstone is included. So it does have that advantage right there. Now, what about Spanish? Okay, what about if you want to read him in Spanish? One thing that you can do is get Lo Mejor de Octavio Paz or El Fuego de Cada Día. This is an anthology that covers all of his work. Sunstone is included here. And the good thing about it is that Paz chose these poems himself. So it's an anthology that was put together by the author himself. Now, let's say you want to read him in Spanish and you just want it all, okay? Here's what I would do. I would get the Cátedra, of course, edition of Libertad Bajo Palabra. This gives you the first phase, including Sunstone. And what I did, because I live here in the US, was to get this one, because this one, yes, it includes Sunstone too, but it gives you all of the later part of his work, and it's bilingual, so I can read it in Spanish. Basically, if you want to read him in Spanish, if you get these two, you have virtually all of the poetry that Octavio Paz published, at least the poetry that he wrote by himself, because there are some works in collaboration that are not included right there, and there are only a couple of poems maybe that are missing from these collections, but that's basically what I would recommend that you do if you want to read him, either in Spanish or in English. Now, what I want to do now is, okay, let's say you tell me, Jorge, I want to read Octavio Paz, but I don't really want to read an entire book. I just want to know what he's all about. I want to read a few poems that give me an idea of what his poetry is like, so that I can sort of sample his work. My friend, I have got you covered, because I'm going to give you now my top 10 Octavio Paz poems. So this is completely personal, okay, completely personal, but let me share with you in the screen right here the titles. You'll have them in Spanish and in English, and I'll read them just in case you're listening to this. So these are the ones that I would recommend to you. Mientras escribo, while I write, this is the one that I mentioned about the process of writing and the split in the personality. Más allá del amor, or Beyond Love. El Río, or the River, a longer poem that has like longer lines also, a la Walt Whitman, that kind of thing. Then, of course, you must read Sunstone or Piedra del Sol, okay? This is mandatory. So if you want to read one poem, one work by Octavio Paz, then absolutely make it this one. Nocturno de San Ildefonso Nocturne, this one just blew my mind. Okay, it's a meditation. It's really so deep. This is another poem that sort of stayed with me. It's going to stay very, very close to my heart. Viento, agua, piedra, wind, water, stone. This is a very brief one, but also a poem that has been anthologized quite a bit because it's quite representative of Paz's approach and his voice also. Fábula de Joan Miró, it's a really nice one, a fable of Joan Miró. Antes del comienzo, or Before the Beginning, is a love poem. I really like Octavio Paz's love poems. It's a different approach to love poetry. It's not what you get, for example, from Pablo Neruda. So I felt that I had to include something that represented that. Carta de Creencia, or Letter of Testimony, is kind of like an ars poetica. So that's why I liked it so much. It's kind of like a summa of his approach to poetry. And this one and the previous three actually are from the collection Árbol Adentro, or A Tree Within. And then the last one that is included, the last one that he wrote in that anthology in English, which is Respuesta y Reconciliación, or Response and Reconciliation. This one is just, I don't even know how to describe it. It just reaches some heights that, you know what I thought when I was reading this one? I sort of thought this is the equivalent of the four quartets, if you look at the work of T.S. Eliot. It's really that deep. It's a meditation on the human condition, history, time. It really does a great job of gathering together the major themes of Octavio Paz at the end of his career, when he was writing basically the last lines of poetry that we have by him. Octavio Paz is a key Latin American poet of the 20th century. He really, if you ask me, deserves that fame as one of the most important Latin American poets of that time, with César Vallejo, with Pablo Neruda, with Jorge Luis Borges, of course, and any other name that you can think of, Gabriela Mistral. He really is one of those poets that doesn't really expect you to figure out the correct way to read his poems or anything like that. Basically, what happens here is that each of his poems, as he himself said, is a living organism, and different people connect with them in different ways. Your reading is a very personal reading. It's an original reading, okay? Because that is the way that these poems are presented. Once again, they're not an object, but an act. And each reading of the poem, as I was suggesting before, might be a very different experience for you too, because we change, and the poem itself is something that is alive. Okay, these are acts that are happening. They are alive and in constant flux. So that's another reason why he is difficult to translate, because your first reading of one of his poems is not the same as the second, and every time, ideally, that you read a poem, you're going to get a different experience. Hopefully some of that survives even the translation. But anyway, Octavio Paz is a poet that I'm going to tell you, you just need to check out. So I hope that you will do that, and if you do, please let me know what you think about his work. Do you have any questions, comments, recommendations, recipes? You know that I'm always listening and always happy to respond to your comments and questions. Those are my 2 cents on the poetry of Octavio Paz. I hope you enjoyed this video. Thank you so much for stopping by, and have a wonderful day.